Hi guys, my name is Harry. I'm one of the tutors for 1001, and this video is going to be a code through of assignment 2, meaning I'm going to start with the blank A2 files and show you how I'd go about taking it to a 20 out of 20 submission. So why are we doing this in a video format rather than doing what we did for assignment 1 and just giving you the solution? Well, my thought process here is that for a student who has done average to poorly on an assignment, they might be equally as confused with the final solution as they were with making a start in the first place. Additionally, they might find it overwhelming to just be presented with the final solution and think, well, this is great, but how the hell was I meant to go about doing that on my own? To address this, what I'm going to attempt to do in this video is vocalize my thought process as I'm coding, and hopefully that's going to make it a little less intimidating the next time you have to start this sort of assignment. I also saw a lot of students who had perfectly functional code that could just be improved in terms of clarity or maintainability. So the second focus of this video will be writing not just code that works, but that is easy to both read and update. Only a little bit more admin to go before we jump into it. In terms of structure, I'll be making two videos here, with one for entities and one for processing. In addition to providing solutions, I'll also try and mimic some of the common errors I saw in your submissions and show how I would deal with them. If I miss any of those errors when I'm going through, they will be added to a section at the end of the video. Okay, so to make a start, on my desktop here, all I have is this assignment 2 folder, which this bird is very interested in. And as I said before, all this contains is just the blank A2 files set up in a way or structured in a way that our tests are going to be able to run. So as for how we're going to be working inside these two videos, we're going to have either entities or processing.py on the left hand side of the screen. Up the very top right, we are going to have our sample tests, which we're not going to be looking at, but we're going to be running these to generate this summary of all the tests we're passing here in the bottom right. And you can tell that this is a blank submission because I am failing practically every test apart from the method stubs that have already been implemented for us. So let's go about fixing that. Coming into entities for the first time, one of the, main questions I got at the very beginning of the assignment was, look, I'm overwhelmed by this massive page of text. Where do I possibly begin? And what I am looking for here is a class out of these four: athlete, results, events, and country. A class which doesn't refer to any other classes within it. So if we take a look at athlete, this is immediately disqualified because, it takes a country object and it's a init method. If we come down to results, however, we can see that results doesn't refer to any of the four classes inside entities at all. And so this is a great place to start, because result is effectively isolated. And you don't have to think about anything else inside entities.py. Okay, so let's make a start here. The init method. Init method takes a result value, which is just a float. And we're going to want to store that here. Self.result value is equal to result value. And you guys should be quite used to this sort of thing by now. Yeah, this is generally what happens every time we set a parameter here in the init method of a class. Okay, so next question I got quite frequently was, these next two methods, getPlace and setPlace, they are talking about a place, right? But when we initialize our result object, we don't actually give it a place by default. And it would be an error here to change our init method to have a place here. Because we're going to be determining the places after we actually create the result objects. And we're going to be doing that inside processing.py. I think actually if you modified the init method here to also have a place as well, you'd get marked down for breaking the implementation that was given to you. Okay, so let's go down again into getPlace and setPlace. If we want to be talking about a place in these cases, we want to be getting or setting a place, then it makes sense to have an internal variable that stores information as to what the place for this result is. So let's say self._place is equal to, and what should it be equal to? Well, as we just said before, we don't give this result object a place by default. So something that would be useful to do here is give it a dummy value. And what I mean by a dummy value is something which doesn't make sense for the athlete to come. An example of this, I guess, would be 0. because an athlete is never going to come 0th in an event. What I will be using instead is just the none type, which is commonly used in this sort of case. So I'm actually now going to leave getPlace and setPlace just for a second, and we're going to focus on this placeIsDetermined method here. And what this method does is just return a boolean if the places have been determined or not. So now that we know what we are setting place to by default, and by default it is none, we ask ourselves, in what cases have the places not been determined yet? And that is very simply, if self._place is equal to none, then we return false because the places haven't been determined yet, right? And if self.place is not equal to none, then we can assume that throughout the lifetime of this instance of a result object or result class, the setPlace method has been called, and we've set the place here from none to some integer. Okay, so otherwise, in all other cases, we can just return true, assuming that setPlace was called correctly. Okay, so you can actually compact this little statement instead to just be return self._place is not equal to none. So to make sure this works logically, right, if self.place is equal to none, then this will return false, and that's what it should, and otherwise it will return true. So that's working as intended. Now that we have places determined, we can come up and start implementing, I guess, all the other methods inside this class. So actually, not getPlace, we'll start with setPlace. Quite simply here, we are setting our internal representation of place to reflect this parameter which is passed in, which is an integer. So we can just say self._place is equal to the place that is passed in here. And that is this method done. Okay, so getPlace now. The difference between getPlace and setPlace is that we actually, and I'm talking about the doc string here, is that we are raising a runtime error if the places are not yet determined. Okay, so if ever you are raising a runtime error within a method, you normally want to be doing that first, and that is so that it fails early, as opposed to, and I guess we'll revisit this later in getMedal, you don't want to be checking a whole lot of things before you even call the runtime error, just because you're sort of wasting time there. But I mean, I'll show you a better example of that later. So, as I said, we want to raise the runtime error early if possible, and we raise it if the places are not yet determined. And we just made a method which checks if the places are determined or not. So let's follow proper practice here and actually use that method so we're not repeating ourselves. Okay, so if, and we raise the runtime error if the places are not yet determined. So I say, if not self.places determined, raise runtime error. And I could put a little message here, places aren't determined. Or you might also want to say as well that you tried to get the place here. I'm not really going to bother with this. Okay. So we've now raised the runtime error if the places aren't determined, and if the places are determined, then we can just return the place that the athlete obtained. So we could say here, return self._place. Or can we? So this is the first stage in which I have made an error on purpose, and I now want to come across to our tests and just see what the tests have to say about this. Okay, so if I scroll up, I can see that result tests are actually failing for getPlace, although this looks perfectly fine. And if I scroll down to Y inside failed tests and come down to result tests, wherever that may be, getMedal, getPlace. Okay, so this is result tests, and the test that we're failing here is getPlace, which is what we were just implementing. So we come down to the bottom here and see that this assertion has failed. It tried to check that we got the string for whatever values it used here when we called it. However, we actually returned the integer for. So here on the left is what we had again, and here on the right is what it was expecting. So you can see that we gave an integer and it was expecting a string. But the value of that was essentially the same. It's just that we returned the wrong sort of type here. So the reason that we failed this test, quite long-windedly, is that getPlace, if you go up in the doc string here, actually returns a string, and we return the int. So all we have to do here is convert self.place to a string before we send it off. Okay. And let's check that that's all working. Come back up the top. I missed it. Okay, and now getPlace is working, as you can see from the tests. So this sort of, I guess, way of coding the assignment, as in doing a little bit of functionality and then running the tests and checking that they work, is what I would say is the best possible way of going about doing the assignment, as long as you have a good test suite behind you. And yeah, that's generally what I'm going to be doing for the rest of these tests to make sure that everything's working fine. Okay, so now that we've done getPlace and setPlace and place is determined, we can come down to getResult. And this would have had the same sort of error if I had just said return self.result value, because result value was a float, and it is stored internally as a float. But again, we want to return it as a string, so we're just going to say return the string version of self._result value. Cool. Okay, get medal now. Also returns a string. The string is the medal the athlete achieved, or if there is no medal, return the empty string. So the medals that the athlete can achieve are gold, silver, and bronze, and every other place, so everything higher than 3, we're just going to return the empty string. And you can see as well, we want to raise a runtime error if the place is not yet determined. Okay, so let's go about doing that first. Remember that if we're raising a runtime error, we want to try and raise that as early as possible. So we can practically just copy the code here we have in getPlace for that first part at least. If the places are not determined yet, raise a runtime error. Okay, cool. Now that we know there is a place, what I'm going to do here is, let me think about this for a second. I mean, you can implement this quite simply by saying, you know, if self.place is equal to 1, return gold. If self.place is equal to 2, return silver, blah, 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 else return the empty string. I'm going to try and do it a little bit differently. I'm going to say if self._place is less than or equal to 3, I want to return gold, silver. I'll stop talking for a second until I've figured this out. Okay, so if self.place is either 3, 2, or 1 in this case, I want to return either gold, silver, or bronze, and the way that I'm determining whether to return gold, silver, or bronze is just, it's going to be the index of the place minus 1. So say for example I come second, if I get second place, right, then my self.place will be equal to 2, subtract 1 from that, and I get the first index of this little list here, and that is going to be silver. So that seems to work out all fine. And in every other case where it's not less than or equal to 3, we just want to return the empty string. Okay, I'm not going to be implementing a string method for result, just because I'm wanting to save time. But you would want to do this in the case that you were going to be printing out the result object later on, or an instance of the result class later on. Okay. Coming down to event now, as I said before, we are going to leave athlete for last. So let's come down to event. So, same sort of thing as last time. We have these parameters in the init method. Let's start to store. Actually, first of all, before we continue, let's just check that the tests ran as we would hope. Okay, and we can see that inside the result class everything's now working fine. Okay, so let's continue on. Event. Okay, so we've got all these now in the init method. Let's go down to the isTimed, and we'll start to add any variables up here as they're needed. I don't think they actually are for the event class. So, isTimed returns a boolean. It returns true if the event is timed, false if the event is scored. And all we are going to return is self._timed, because that is where that information is stored. Okay, same sort of thing for name, return self._event name. Get athletes. We have an internal list of athletes here, or rather here, self.athlete, so we can just return that. Okay, adding an athlete to the list. What I'm going to say here is self._athletes.append this particular athlete. And then, coming down for add athletes, the difference between these two methods is that athlete is going to be a singular athlete in add athlete. Athlete. And inside add athletes with athletes here, this variable refers, or parameter rather, refers to a list of athletes. So what I'm going to say is for athlete in athletes, self.add athlete. God, that's a lot of athletes. Anyway, the reason that I'm doing this instead of, say for example, something like self.athletes, is that with the underscore there, of course, athletes.extend athletes, or something along the same sort of vein, you could concatenate the two lists, is that, say for example, my implementation of add athlete changed. Maybe I don't want to just append an athlete to this list anymore. Maybe I want to only append it to the list if this current athlete that I'm adding is not already in this list of athletes. Well, same sort of thing as within the results class, and that, if place is determined method. I only now have to change one little section inside add athlete as opposed to changing add athlete and add athletes. So say in that case that I wanted to only add athletes to the list once, I could say if athlete not in athletes, then do this. Oops. And I mean, the default implementation works fine, I believe, for all the tests that we're running, so this is not an issue. But later on, that's the sort of case that you want to be wary of. You don't really want to be able to add the same athlete to a list 1,000 times. Yeah, okay, continuing on. Let's check that that's all working, and I hope I haven't made any mistakes there, although maybe that would be quite useful for you guys. Alright, now events are all working. Okay, country time. Same sort of thing you're used to, self.country. Okay, so just like in results, when we had methods that were talking about, what were they talking about? Places, right? We have methods here in country that are talking about athletes, but we don't have anything in the init method which is a list of athletes, right? So it would be good in this case to make an empty list of athletes by default, and then eventually add them with these add athlete and add athletes method later on. So now that we have this variable self.athletes, we can just return self._athletes. Add athletes, we can practically copy all the code we had here. Getting the name is quite simple. We just return self._country name. Return self._country code. And now let's check that this runs again. Awesome, now we just have athletes to go. Okay, up the very top. I might end up skipping the parts of the video where I just have to do the same sort of thing over and over again. So I might come back to you when this is actually done. Okay, so now it's talking about getting a result inside this athlete, and we currently have no way of storing information about results. So we could do a few things here. We could use a list. We could use a list of tuples which mapped events to results, but that would be sort of unnecessary and a bit weird. More, I guess, appropriately, we could make a dictionary, and that dictionary could be named something like results, and we could set it by default to just be the empty dictionary. So what would be the keys and the values for this dictionary? And we should probably make a comment about this up here. So the keys are going to be the events, and the values are going to be the results. Inside getResults, I can just say, if we wanted to return the result for the athlete, I just say return self.results event as the key. And again, this will just return the value inside that dictionary associated with the event, which is the key. Okay, similarly for this, we can use self._results event is equal to result. So this sets the value of result to be associated with this key inside this dictionary, and it will actually override it if previously set. So this is all good. Okay, now we have our next error, or not error rather, but a roadblock. We have add event and add events and get events, and again we have no internal way of having any information about events. And from the look of it, they're expecting us to build up some sort of list of events. So let's do that. Let's make a new variable called self._events and set it by default to the empty list. Actually, that's sort of useless to make a comment for. And then that's very easy to add to. If we are going to add an event to this internal list, we say self._events.append the event. Add events for event in events self.add event event. Get events, just return self.events. Get ID, what was that identifier? Just return this. Now let's check that everything's working properly. Okay, and we can see now that we have all tests passing for entities. I forgot to mention that I'm actually not going to be looking at the load data test because there were no marks associated with load data. Yeah, I'm just going to be focusing on, I guess, all the entities that we looked at and then processing, and I won't even be looking at making a main method inside processing to load in our own tests or anything like that. Okay, so I'm going to quickly cover one of the errors that I saw quite often, and let's do that inside athlete. So inside add events, I saw this quite often. Also, not add events, but similar methods like add events. People might have this great idea of using this internal method add events, but they would refer to it as that because they are so used to doing things like return self._events or self._identifier. And let's look at what the appropriate error message would look like for that error. Okay, never mind. This is the issue here is that these tests are not, I guess, conclusive, and I've modified something like that instead, and we're not actually testing for that. Let me try and find somewhere else that's going to cause an error. Yeah, okay, let's do this. Okay, now we're seeing that getPlace is failing inside the results test. And why might that be? Well, it says attribute error here. Result object has no attribute _places_determined. So it's taking a look at this line I have here, and if I look at that, that is line 109. And it says, self._places_determined, never heard of it. And the reason is that we don't have any attribute in this class with this name, _places_determined. So we're looking for exact name matching here. We can see that places_determined doesn't actually start with an underscore, and so that's going to cause the error. I got that surprisingly often in some submissions, and it just leads me to believe that the tests here weren't being run alongside the code while they were actually writing it. Either that, or they weren't sure how to resolve this specific error message. But that is essentially how you go about it. Okay, so for a brief amendment to the video, let's come into athletes and look at this variable for a second, and let's all pay attention to the fact that I have actually misnamed this variable. So if we are going to be calling something self._results, my immediate thought is that results would actually be a list of results. And I mean, that's not really what we have here. We are making a dictionary with the keys being events and the values being results. So perhaps a better name for this dictionary would be event results, or maybe just a result dict. And this is a much better variable name because it tells me the intent of, or I guess what this dictionary is going to be storing. And after we name it like this, we actually don't need this comment telling us what the key and the values are, because it's sort of implicit in the name there. Okay, but I'll just leave it as results there because other code relied on that. So coming down into results, the second thing that I'd like to amend is that this line here, if a student wrote this, I would expect a comment just because, I mean, it's not as immediately readable as if self.place is equal to 1, return gold. So yeah, just a very quick comment telling what the intent of this line is. So just something like that. Okay, but that was really all the amendments I had for my code. There were some very small error messages, or common error messages that I missed as well. Namely, people just naming variables incorrectly again. So I showed you what happens if you add the underscore before a function or a method name, and I gave the example on, or at least I tried to give the example on add events here, and that didn't work, and we came down into results to fix that. The opposite error also happened quite a lot, in that people would do this instead, self.events instead of the underscore there, and that would cause a similar sort of error. It would say something like athlete class has no attribute, blah 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 blah. Okay, I think that is all for this video. I know it's a bit boring in cases me just doing, I guess, monotonous self return self dot blah 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 blah. Next one should be a little more interesting. We'll move on to processing and do some, I guess, a bit more difficult logic. Alright, thank you very much for watching. See you soon.